Kamala was the candidate of the CNN green room and elite journos. She was the Jeff Zucker candidate. She was if you were somebody in LA or New York with a lot of money and a lot of connections in media, Kamala was someone that you were really in favor. It wasn't Biden. It wasn't Biden early on. Kamala was, Jeff, I think Zucker, by the way, he was the president of CNN before he completely destroyed that media entity such that it will never recover. He threw fundraisers for her. I mean, it was that level of that, when I say I'm not just theorizing that she was his candidate, she was his candidate. Or he had attended fundraisers for her. But anyway, I think that there are journos who felt like they carried her to the role of vice president, and they're spewing a little vitriol because they're disappointed, because they feel like their personal brands. They did all this to put Kamala in this position, and she hasn't delivered in a way that reflects poorly on them at some level. That's what I see here, because when you have the New York Times and a bunch of anonymous staffers trashing the vice president, something's going on.
Front page, Monday edition, New York Times absolutely savages Kamala Harris. And we had a story from the Washington Post, I believe it was last week, that did the same. And what I will just posit for everyone out there is when your propaganda outlets, the New York Times and the Washington Post, which are effectively mouthpieces for the Democrat Party, when they are coming out and completely and totally destroying the vice president of the United States in a front page article in each newspaper, it is pretty debilitating for Kamala Harris. Now, I wanted to read for you, Buck, a couple of the quotes that were out there in this piece on Kamala Harris and let you kind of think about this. This is in the New York Times front page article on Kamala Harris today. The painful reality for Miss Harris is that in private conversations over the last few months, dozens of Democrats in the White House, on Capitol Hill, and around the nation, including some who helped put her on the party's 2020 ticket, said she had not risen to the challenge of proving herself as a future leader of the party, much less the country. Even some Democrats whom her own advisors referred reporters to for supportive quotes confided privately they had lost hope in her. Through much of the fall, a quiet panic set in among key Democrats about what would happen if President Biden opted not to run for a second term. Most Democrats interviewed who insisted on anonymity to avoid alienating the White House said flatly they did not think Ms. Harris could win the presidency in 2024. Some even said the party's biggest challenge would be finding a way to sideline her without inflaming key Democratic constituencies that would take offense. Buck, that is a flamethrower on Kamala Harris from the New York Times.
It's the analysis that we've been giving here for a long time now, which is they got a problem in this Democrat Party. It also goes to why I have believed all along, and I know you now agree, and this could also shift for both of us depending on events and how it all goes, right? Remember, Trump was going to get indicted, and that was the whole plan with the documents, and then they found a bunch of classified documents at Biden. So even if it was the plan to indict Trump, events can change where everything is going. But I think it's been clear for a while that because, and you can see, Clay, in this New York Times piece, it's dripping with frustration, right? There's this sense of, oh, come on, we wanted Kamala to be a better vice president than she's been, and they're airing this out. I do wonder why, like what the New York Times always does things like this for a purpose. Maybe they're just throwing a tantrum over it, but there perhaps is a longer term political goal that you'd have to look at here. But this is why all along I've thought it has to be Biden, because when you war game this out, when you look at how the different pathways this could go, Biden not running again means there's an expectation that the vice president, remember, he's a sitting president, so it's not like he's finished his 2 terms and, let's have a primary and see. Biden stepping down and not running and not taking advantage of the incumbency and it not being Kamala, to the point being made here in the New York Times, the single most reliable Democrat constituency in the country is black female voters, right? They are, from an electoral perspective, they're the beating heart. They're the center of the base of the Democrat Party, black female voters. The first real opportunity the Democrat Party has to elevate the first black female president, and they push her aside for smooth-talking slimeball Gavin Newsom? I don't think so. I just think that's too I don't think they could come up with smooth enough propaganda to explain that internally in the Democrat Party without it completely blowing up in their faces. I don't see it.
I think you're right. As bad as Joe Biden's approval ratings are, as this article states, Kamala Harris's approval ratings are worse. But this sentence, I just can't get over. How out of touch even are Kamala Harris's advisors? Even some Democrats whom her own advisors referred reporters to for supportive quotes confided privately they had lost hope in her. In the New York Times. I mean, we're not talking about, Breitbart writing a takedown piece of Kamala Harris. This is what should be the base of Kamala Harris's support, eviscerating her.
Now, I think maybe a helpful way to look at this is to understand the same way that when people ask me about the CIA, Clay, and I say, you've got to think of the CIA the way you'd think of like a big state school. To ask what's it like or who's there, well, are we talking about athletes or math majors? Are we talking about...
It's got everything. It's so big.
It's so big that it's just this massive entity. And I think when you look at an administration, we often have this view of, it's the administration. Now, in a policy sense, there's some truth that obviously, and I'll talk about the apparatus, all the little bureaucracies and agencies and individuals at the top pushing forward an agenda. But within each administration, Republican or Democrat, there are fiefdoms. There are little kingdoms within the kingdom. And there are people who are working in those who... that this is a professional choice they have made, meaning their own careerism comes into play. A president, a vice president. You go to the vice president's office, you work on the vice president's staff. Why? So that, generally speaking, you're going to move on and work in a future White House directly. People generally don't want to, the vice president's staff is a means to an end for a lot of people professionally. You do that so that you're on the launch pad for the other bigger job. You go from being the key aide to the vice president to maybe a deputy White House chief of staff, or maybe, something like that. And so I think that a lot of the people who were promised, go work for Kamala, working for Kamala is going to be amazing. And maybe she's going to be the next president, are just bitter. I really think they're individually bitter about the professional choice that they have made, because she's not going to be their ticket to the next big job.
That's a good analysis. Let me also blow your mind here. You're a history guy. I was doing research on this. In the last 100 years, how many two-term presidents have been succeeded by their vice president? Because a lot of times out there, let me kind of set the context here again. So many people out there say, the vice president's a heartbeat away. How often has it been the case in the last 100 years in America that you have a two-term serving president who is then succeeded by his vice president for his own term?
Oh, man. Once?
Once is the answer.
The
Good
buck
job.
Always delivers.
George Bush Sr. followed Ronald Reagan. And, you tried to have, even recently, Al Gore was trying to follow Clinton. And you certainly had, a situation Obama did not pick his vice president, and now vice president has ended up in the office. But the point is that catbird seat for the vice president, this idea that you're going to catapult in, if there's not a death or if there is not a debilitating action that takes place to elevate you from the vice president, It's pretty crazy to think about, right?
Well, and it's fascinating when you see what happened with, the current president, Biden, was not able to leverage 2 terms as the vice president to being the guy for the Democrats. We all remember 2016. We all remember what happened. So you really have a political rule here that being vice president means you're on deck during your party's presidency. It does not mean you are on deck in any meaningful way after a 1 or a 2 term presidency.
So you asked, what are they getting at? And I think that's such the important question here. When the New York Times and the Washington Post are both savaging Kamala. First of all, I think there is now a clear, unless Joe Biden basically has a debilitating health attack at some point.
It's him.
He is the nominee,
he's running.
and there's not even going to be a significant challenger. But I think what they're already working towards is Kamala not as the face of the party, right? So if Biden wins in 24, immediately the spin becomes there's no incumbent president. What's going to happen in 28? As bad as Mayor Pete has been, he hasn't gotten savage like Kamala Harris in the press. As bad as Joe Biden has been, Kamala Harris actually gotten savaged, I think, worse than Joe Biden in the press. Of anybody out there, she has the lowest approval rating and the most savagery directed towards her. I think it's because she's the next man up, and they're trying to end her.
And I also think that there's the same way that there's bitterness from the staffers around Kamala who went to work for her because they thought, that this was the law. And maybe it still is for some of them. They'll work for a Biden, term 2 or something. But, as you know, in politics, you really attach yourself to the politician. And that people are picking teams. When you pick a politician, you are picking a team. Certainly true when you're talking about a general election or a primary, but even within an administration, the people that work for Nikki Haley, for example, when she was at when she was U.S. ambassador to the United Nations under Trump, those are the people that when she's running to try to be president for the Republican side are going to be around her. And we all understand how that works. I think that there are a lot of journalists because Kamala was the candidate of the CNN green room and elite journos. She was the Jeff Zucker candidate. She was if you were somebody in LA or New York with a lot of money and a lot of connections in media, Kamala was someone that you were really in favor. It wasn't Biden. It wasn't Biden early on. Kamala was, Jeff, I think Zucker, by the way, he was the president of CNN before he completely destroyed that media entity such that it will never recover. He threw fundraisers for her. I mean, it was that level of that, when I say I'm not just theorizing that she was his candidate, she was his candidate. Or he had attended fundraisers for her. But anyway, I think that there are journos who felt like they carried her to the role of vice president, and they're spewing a little vitriol because they're disappointed. Because they feel like their personal brands. They did all this to put Kamala in this position, and she hasn't delivered in a way that reflects poorly on them at some level. That's what I see here. Because when you have the New York Times and a bunch of anonymous staffers trashing the vice president,
the only other thing for everybody to think about: is it possible that Joe Biden could walk away from her as his vice president? Because if you're getting her trash, remember there was the talk about, hey, we're going to put her on the Supreme Court. We'll find another place to put her. Is it possible that Joe Biden, because think about this, her ineptitude is actually going to be a major story in 2024 because Biden's going to be 82. Like, it's always a matter of if you're the heartbeat away. But it's not crazy to think that Biden from 82 to 86, if he somehow got dragged across the finish line weekend at Bernie's 2 style, she might really matter way more than any vice president ever has before, just based on his age. Just tossing it out there. Is this giving him a little space to contemplate tossing her off the ticket?
And then I assume, given the Democrat Party's realities, you'd be looking at a replacement on the ticket who is also a black female vice president. I think that would have to be, and so then there's a short list of people that would come to mind. Maybe this is what happens, but I just think they try to push. Look what they did, Clay. I always return to this. What they did in 2020 was reckless and crazy, and somehow the guy became president. And I mean, that Joe Biden was the nominee, and they pushed this doddering old fool forward that everybody knows is not very smart, is not very ethical, is not very accomplished in any meaningful way. He's just been around forever, so he's a name people know. That's it. They pushed it forward, and we all know what ended up happening. So I just feel like they're ready for round two, but it's a crazy world we live in, folks. I could be wrong.